Prosecutors in Florida have released hundreds of pages of new evidence relating to their case against Casey Anthony. NBC's Kerry Sanders is in Orlando, Florida with all the details. Good morning, Kerry.
Well, good morning, Amy. The strength of the prosecution's case is beginning to take shape as more records are made public. This batch of 300 documents now out brings the total number of pages that have been released in this case to more than 5,200.
23-year-old Casey Anthony, accused of killing her 2-year-old daughter Kaylee, says she didn't do it. But in just released documents, even a member of her own family tells investigators there are doubts. In a lengthy interview with detectives, Casey's maternal grandmother talks about the rivalry between Casey and her mother Cindy and how Kaylee was in the middle. Shirley Placia says, "I just wondered if she, Casey, hated her mom more than she loved Kaylee." She tells detectives 4 months before Kaylee's body was discovered what she thinks it'll take for Casey to tell what she knows. She probably needs someone to threaten her personally. You know, I hate to think about her being put in a jail with them women that's going to beat the hell out of her, but it might do her some good. Shirley Placia says Casey had stolen and forged one of her checks to pay $54 for her daughter's second birthday party and blames an unemployed Casey for running up the family debt to $45,000 long before Kaylee even went missing. In interviews with detectives, Placia says the mysterious babysitter, Zenaida Zanny Gonzalez, who Casey claims last had her child, had long been discussed in family conversations, even though no one had ever met the woman. Whenever they talked about a babysitter a year ago or so, they talked about Zanny. But one-time best friend Melina Calabresi says Casey had a tendency to lie. She would put bits of truth together to make up a story, and then she would start believing her own story.
Did you see it?
When detectives traced Casey's cell phone calls in that first month her daughter was missing and allegedly being held by the babysitter, they report no calls were made or received from a telephone number subscribed to a Zenaida Gonzalez.
A spokesperson for the defense says they'll respond to the strength of the prosecution's case in a courtroom. A trial date is set for October. Amy?
NBC's Kerry Sanders, thank you. Dan Abrams is the chief legal analyst for NBC News. Dan, good morning.
Good morning, Amy.
So we just heard in Kerry's piece a lot of damning statements by Casey's own grandmother. The fact that she claims stole $45,000 from her parents. There's tension between Casey and her mother, and the fact that the grandmother says maybe Casey could use some time in jail.
Yeah, I mean, interesting, fascinating, but not necessarily all relevant in the context of this case. Remember, just because other relatives think she's a bad person, for example, doesn't mean it's going to be relevant in her murder case. But when you talk about stealing money, for example, could that be relevant? Yeah, it could be. How? Because it might go to motive. The prosecutors might say she was tired of having a child. She couldn't afford it. It was weighing on her, etc. So then it does become relevant, but it isn't automatically relevant just because it's about her.
Yeah, what will prosecutors do to try and get some of this admitted? Obviously, they would want to.
Yeah, because then they've got to shape their argument to say, this is the reason it matters in this case. They have to say, we're not just trying to argue she's a bad person. We're trying to argue that it's relevant to this particular case of her daughter.
Any insight now into how prosecutors are building this case, given some of the stuff we're seeing come out in this discovery process?
It sounds like inconsistent statements are enormously important. The prosecutors are trying to show that the accounts that Casey gave to friends and family members in the period between the time that Kaylee disappeared and the time it was reported, meaning there's a lot of talk here about comments she made that the prosecutors are going to say either don't make sense or show that she knew that she could be in trouble. And I think that's going to be very important. It's
also interesting, Kerry pointed out, some 5,000 pages of documents have been released. We're still 7 months out from the trial. How unusual is it for this amount of discovery to be made public?
You know, the reality is in high-profile cases, there tends to be more discovery. Should it be that way? Does it mean that there's actually more or less evidence? Look, there tends to be more evidence. Why? Prosecutors and investigators tend to take the case more seriously. The defense attorneys tend to be on them all the time. They tend to get more tips. as well in high-profile cases. A lot of people call in, etc. So yes, there tends to be more discovery, as we call it, in high-profile cases. But still, it's a lot of
And then you get the question: can she have a fair trial given all of this pre-trial publicity?
Yeah, and look, and I think that they will be able to figure out a way to do it. Either by finding jurors who simply don't know that much about the case, haven't developed opinions about the case, or in a worst-case scenario, they'll move the case. But most of the time, you're able to find a jury, even in a local area, even when there's an enormous amount of media attention.
All right, Dan Abrams, thanks as always.
Amy,